After the pilots fainted during the flight, a 12-year-old boy takes control of the plane. The roar of the engines filled the cabin, and passengers settled into their seats for what they thought would be an uneventful flight. Families whispered over the hum of the plane. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisles with calm efficiency, and the vast expanse of blue sky stretched endlessly beyond the small oval windows. Somewhere in the middle rows, a 12-year-old boy named Ethan sat with his nose pressed to the glass, his wide eyes soaking in the clouds. He wasn't just fascinated by the view. Ethan was obsessed with airplanes. He knew every model, every button in the cockpit, and even how the controls worked, thanks to countless hours spent on flight simulators. It was his dream to be a pilot one day. But today, his dream was about to collide with a nightmare no one could have imagined. The flight had been smooth for most of the journey, just another routine trip across the country. But as they soared at 35,000 feet, a sense of unease began to ripple through the cabin. It started subtly. One of the flight attendants disappeared into the cockpit and didn't come out for several minutes. Then another followed, her hurried steps betraying the calm expression on her face. Passengers began to whisper. Was it turbulence? A technical issue? But the plane was steady. There was no announcement from the captain, no reassuring words over the intercom. Just an unnerving silence that grew heavier with every passing second. Ethan noticed it too. His parents were sitting beside him, flipping through magazines and trying to stay relaxed. But Ethan's gut told him something was wrong. He had studied enough aviation to know that silence from the cockpit wasn't a good sign. Then out of nowhere, the plane jolted, not violently, but enough to make drinks spill and conversations stop mid-sentence. A collective gasp echoed through the cabin as the seatbelt signs lit up. A voice crackled over the intercom, but it wasn't the captain. It was one of the flight attendants, her tone trembling as she spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing an unexpected situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll provide more information shortly. Ethan's heart raced. He couldn't help but glance at his parents, but they gave him reassuring smiles. Still, he wasn't convinced. His instincts told him this wasn't normal. Minutes felt like hours as passengers waited for answers. And then it happened. A second announcement came, this time more frantic, more desperate. Is there anyone on board with flight experience? Please press your call button immediately. This is an emergency. Guests erupted throughout the cabin. People looked at one another in confusion and fear. Ethan froze in his seat, the words echoing in his mind. This is an emergency. The murmurs grew louder. Ethan could hear snippets of conversations around him. What's going on? Why would they ask for that? Do you think something happened to the pilots? Ethan's hands gripped the armrests as a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't stay silent anymore. He turned to his mom, his voice shaking. Mom, I think the pilots might be unconscious or... He couldn't even finish the sentence. Before his mom could respond, the flight attendant who had made the announcement appeared at the front of the cabin, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she had aged 10 years in just minutes. Please, he said, her voice cracking, if anyone here has ever flown a plane, any plane, please let us know now. A man in a business suit stood up hesitantly. I've flown small Cessnas before, but that's it, he said. I'm not qualified for a commercial jet. The flight attendant nodded, her hands trembling. We may need your help. Please come with me. As the man walked toward the cockpit, Ethan's mind raced. He knew he wasn't supposed to get involved. He was just a kid after all. But his knowledge of airplanes was far beyond most adults. He had spent hundreds of hours on simulators, practicing takeoffs, landings, and handling emergencies. He even knew the specific model they were flying, a Boeing 737. Still, this wasn't a game. This was real. And the weight of that reality made his stomach churn. The minutes dragged on as passengers waited for news. But then the worst fears were confirmed. The flight attendant returned, this time with tears in her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "both of our pilots have been incapacitated. We're doing everything we can to manage the situation." The cabin erupted into chaos. People shouted, cried, and clutched their loved ones. The sound was deafening, but Ethan could only hear the pounding of his own heart. This was it. This was the moment he had read about in every aviation thriller, the situation pilots trained for but hoped would never happen. And here he was, a 12-year-old boy in the middle of it all. He looked at his parents, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "I can help," he said. His mom's eyes widened. "Ethan, no. This isn't a simulator. This is real life. It's too dangerous." "But I know how to fly this plane," he insisted. "I know it sounds crazy, but I've studied everything about this. I've practiced emergencies just like this one. If they don't have anyone else." His dad placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression torn between pride and terror. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded. "I can do this." Just then, the flight attendant walked past their row again, her face a mixture of desperation and determination. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice firm and confident. "I can help." The flight attendant stopped in her tracks, her eyes scanning the boy in disbelief. "Sweetheart, this isn't a game," she said gently. "I know," Ethan replied, his gaze unwavering. "But I know how to fly this plane. You have to trust me." For a moment, the flight attendant just stared at him, her mind clearly racing. The cabin was still in chaos, but she seemed to block out the noise as she looked at Ethan, trying to decide whether this boy could possibly be the answer to their prayers, or another risk they couldn't afford to take. Finally, she nodded. "Come with me." Ethan's heart pounded as he stepped into the aisle, every eye in the cabin on him. He didn't feel like a kid anymore. This was real, and he was about to face the challenge of his life. As the cockpit door closed behind him, the weight of the moment hit him like a tidal wave. The controls, the blinking lights, the endless sky ahead. It was all exactly like the simulators he had spent years mastering. But this time, there was no reset button. The lives of everyone on board depended on him. As Ethan stepped into the cockpit, his breath caught. It was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The array of buttons, levers, and glowing screens looked just like the ones he had studied for years in his bedroom. But there was one glaring difference. The two pilots slumped in their seats, unresponsive, their headsets askew. Ethan swallowed hard. This wasn't a simulation. The flight attendant, who had introduced herself as Maria, quickly explained the situation. "We think it might have been food poisoning," she said, her voice tight. "The pilots had their meal about an hour ago, and shortly after, they started feeling unwell. We tried everything, but they both passed out." Ethan's eyes darted to the yoke and the throttle controls, then to the altimeter and the navigation systems. The autopilot was still engaged, keeping the plane steady for now. But autopilot couldn't land the plane. It couldn't handle emergencies like this. Maria placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, pulling him out of his thoughts. "We've contacted air traffic control. They're aware of the situation and are ready to guide us. But we need someone to take the controls. Are you sure you can do this?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I've practiced flying this exact model on my simulator. I know the systems, the controls, the landing procedures. I can do this. I just need their guidance." Maria hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll stay here with you. You're not alone in this." She grabbed a headset and handed one to Ethan. "Let's get you connected to air traffic control." Ethan slipped on the headset, his hands trembling slightly. He could hear the voice of a calm, steady air traffic controller on the other end. "This is Phoenix Center. We understand you have an emergency. Who am I speaking with?" Ethan pressed the button to speak, his voice surprisingly steady. "This is Ethan Parker. I'm 12 years old, and I'll be taking control of the aircraft." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then the controller responded, his tone careful but encouraging. "All right, Ethan. We're here to help you. First, confirm your current altitude and airspeed. Let's take this one step at a time." Ethan's eyes scanned the instruments, and he read off the numbers. The controller's voice remained calm as he began giving instructions. "Good. Now keep the plane steady while we work on a plan to get you safely on the ground." Back in the cabin, the tension was palpable. Passengers sat frozen in their seats, some clutching their armrests, others whispering prayers. Word had spread about the boy in the cockpit, and while some were skeptical, others clung to the hope that his unique skills could save them all. Meanwhile, Ethan focused on the task at hand. With every instruction from the controller, he felt a little more confident, though the weight of the responsibility was immense. He knew the landing would be the most challenging part. He had practiced hundreds of virtual landings, but the thought of doing it for real, with the lives of over 100 passengers depending on him, was almost too much to bear. Maria noticed his hesitation and leaned in. "You're doing great, Ethan. Just remember, you're not alone. We're all rooting for you." Her words gave him a small boost of courage. He nodded, his grip on the yoke firm. But just as he began to feel a sense of control, an alarm blared in the cockpit. The autopilot disengaged without warning, and the plane dipped slightly, causing a ripple of screams from the cabin. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat as he grabbed the yoke and leveled the aircraft. "Phoenix Center, the autopilot just disconnected," he said, his voice rising in panic. The controller's voice came back immediately. "Stay calm, Ethan. You're doing fine. Manual control is more challenging, but we'll guide you through it. Just keep the plane steady and follow my instructions." Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He adjusted the trim and stabilized the altitude, his mind racing as he remembered everything he had learned. Back in the cabin, Ethan's parents were holding each other tightly. His mom was visibly trembling, while his dad kept whispering, "You can do this. He's got this." Around them, other passengers exchanged fearful glances, wondering how a child could possibly manage what trained pilots had spent years mastering. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Maria worked tirelessly to support Ethan. She relayed messages from the cabin crew, helped monitor the instruments, and kept him focused. As the plane began its descent, the tension reached its peak. The controller gave Ethan precise instructions: how to line up with the runway, adjust the flaps, and manage the speed. Ethan followed every word, his palms sweaty but his mind laser-focused. The clouds parted, and the runway came into view. Ethan's breath hitched at the sight of it. It was so much smaller than it seemed in the simulators. "All right, Ethan," the controller said. "This is the most critical part. You're going to lower the landing gear and reduce your speed. Keep the nose up as you approach, and don't panic if it feels bumpy. You've got this." Maria gave him a reassuring nod. "We're almost there. Just take it one step at a time." Ethan's hands moved instinctively, lowering the landing gear and adjusting the throttle. The plane's speed decreased, and the runway grew larger in the windshield. But just as they were about to touch down, a sudden gust of wind rocked the aircraft, tilting it to one side. Ethan gasped, his heart pounding as he fought to correct the angle. The passengers screamed, and even Maria looked alarmed. "Stay with it, Ethan," the controller said firmly. "You've trained for this. You know what to do." Gritting his teeth, Ethan adjusted the ailerons and brought the plane back on course. The runway was just seconds away now. He held his breath, his entire body tense as he guided the plane closer and closer to the ground. The wheels of the plane screeched as they touched the runway, sending vibrations through the entire aircraft. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Time slowed, and Ethan held his breath, gripping the controls tightly. The plane bounced slightly, but stayed aligned with the center of the runway. Ethan adjusted the throttle, bringing the speed down as the plane raced forward. "Reverse thrust, Ethan," the air traffic controller instructed, his voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded, even though no one could see him, and pulled the lever for the reverse thrusters. The plane's engines roared, and the speed began to drop dramatically. Outside, the runway markers sped past the windows, but they were slowing enough to bring the aircraft safely to a halt. Finally, the plane came to a complete stop. For a moment, there was only silence. Ethan's hands hovered over the controls, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Maria was the first to break the stillness, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Ethan blinked, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had landed a plane, a real full-sized commercial jet, and everyone on board was safe. Cheers erupted from the cabin behind them, loud and unrestrained. Passengers clapped, cried, and hugged one another. Ethan could hear snippets of their gratitude. "That kid saved us. He's a hero. I can't believe it." Maria quickly got on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely. Emergency crews are on their way. Please remain seated as we assess the situation. Thank you for your patience and bravery." Ethan leaned back in the pilot's seat, the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion and relief. His parents rushed into the cockpit moments later, their faces a mix of disbelief and pride. His mom wrapped him in a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. "You're amazing, Ethan," she said. "I've never been so proud." His dad smiled, his voice breaking as he spoke. "You kept your cool out there. You saved all of us." Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane, their flashing lights reflecting off the windows. A team of medics rushed in to tend to the incapacitated pilots, while airport officials escorted the passengers off the plane one row at a time. Ethan stayed in the cockpit for a moment longer, staring at the controls he had just mastered under impossible pressure. As he finally stepped out, a wave of applause greeted him. Passengers lined the aisle, clapping and cheering as he walked through the cabin. Some even reached out to shake his hand or pat his shoulder. Ethan's cheeks turned red, but he couldn't help the small smile that crept onto his face. Outside on the tarmac, reporters and cameras had already gathered, capturing the extraordinary story that had unfolded. Ethan and his family were ushered away for privacy, but word spread quickly about the boy who had saved a flight. Later that evening, as they sat in a quiet airport lounge, Ethan's dad looked at him with a grin. "You've always talked about being a pilot. I think today proved you've got what it takes." Ethan smiled shyly, still processing everything that had happened. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "I had help from everyone. Maria, air traffic control. I just did what I could." His mom squeezed his hand. "And that was more than enough. You were brave when it mattered most." In the days that followed, Ethan's story spread across news channels and social media. People marveled at his composure and skill, calling him a hero. But for Ethan, the real reward was knowing he had made a difference, that he had faced a challenge bigger than he ever imagined, and come out stronger for it. As they boarded their connecting flight home, this time with a fresh crew of pilots at the helm, Ethan took one last look at the cockpit door. He smiled to himself, already imagining the day he'd step through it again, not as a passenger, but as a pilot. And so, the 12-year-old boy who had taken control of a plane in an unimaginable moment of crisis proved that courage, knowledge, and a calm head could turn an impossible situation into a story of triumph.